Hello, I'm Esther Gitu-Ewart. Welcome to Africa 54. Here's what's coming up. U.S. President Joe Biden addresses the Democratic National Convention to polish his legacy and pass the baton to Vice President Kamala Harris. Sudan peace talks are ongoing as the country reopens its border with Chad, allowing aid into areas of the Darfur region threatened with famine. And health officials worldwide are on high alert for the spread of Mpox. What can be done? We'll hear from a public health expert. All this and much more coming up on today's Africa 54. U.S. President Joe Biden was the headline speaker on the first night of the Democratic National Convention. The president sought to burnish his legacy Monday night and pass the torch to Vice President Kamala Harris as the party's new presidential nominee. White House Bureau Chief Patsy Widakuswara reports from Chicago.
Introduced by his daughter Ashley, President Joe Biden received a hero's welcome.
Thank you.
At the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, Illinois, he fulfilled his promise to be a transitional leader.
Are you ready to elect Kamala Harris and Tim Walz?
And gave his full support to Kamala Harris, the party's new presidential nominee for the November election.
But she'll be a president our children can look up to. She'll be a president respected by world leaders because she already is. She'll be a president we can all be proud of. And she will be a historic president who puts her stamp on America's future.
Biden was unchallenged at the Democratic primaries. Just a month ago, the roughly 4,000 delegates here were set to nominate him. But Monday, he balanced support for Harris and his achievements in office.
COVID no longer controls our lives. We've gone from economic crisis to the strongest economy in the entire world. Record 16 million new jobs. Record small business growth. Record high stock market. Record high 401ks. Wages up and inflation down, way down, and continuing to go down.
It started with the debate against Republican nominee former President Trump in late June. Biden, who is 81, had such dismal performance that people questioned his mental acuity. Then an assassination attempt on Trump that rallied Republicans and pushed him further ahead in the polls. For weeks, Biden insisted he would remain in the race, even as party leaders privately asked him to step aside.
Joe Biden is a one-term president who was forced off the ticket by the leaders of the Democratic Party despite having won the nomination in the primaries. He's now asked to make an enthusiastic endorsement of his vice president, Kamala Harris. It doesn't take a Sigmund Freud to realize that he might be very conflicted about this.
If he's conflicted, then Joe Biden is not showing it at all, expressing strong support for Kamala Harris and basking in the love and gratitude of his party. We spoke to some convention delegates here on the floor.
It was a beautiful speech. It was a great speech of a culmination of years and years of service.
Well, I think his legacy is strong and positive, and tonight he told the American public why he loves them and what he did for 50 years to serve our nation. And it's an incredible record.
This despite Trump trying to sow division among Democrats.
They forced him out. It was a coup. We had a coup. That was the first coup in the history of our country.
Biden repeated Democrats' theme of Harris, a former prosecutor, going against Trump, who has been found guilty in court.
And crime will keep coming down when we put a prosecutor in the Oval Office instead of a convicted felon.
Biden ended his speech with an embrace from Harris, cementing his role among Democrats as the leader who could possibly save the country again from Trump, this time by passing the torch.
Joe, thank you for your historic leadership, for your lifetime of service to our nation, and for all you will continue to do. We are forever grateful to you.
Atsida Kuswara, VOA News, Chicago.
Former U.S. President Barack Obama and Second Gentleman Doug Emhoff are set to speak Tuesday on the second day of the Democratic National Convention as the party turns its attention toward Vice President Kamala Harris and her battle against Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump. For more on the preview of Tuesday's DNC, let's go live to VOA's Carol Van Dam, who is standing by in Chicago. Hello, Carol. Carol, tell us what kind of message can we expect from tonight's speakers?
Hi, Esther. Well, I'm sure you're going to hear a lot of kinds of the same messages that we heard last night about all the things that are at stake for this country. They're going to probably paint it in very stark terms that, you know, our very democracy is at threat, because we've heard that before from many Democratic leaders in the party. Like you mentioned, or like my colleague Patsy just mentioned there, that we're going to hear from the Obamas tonight, former President Barack Obama and the former First Lady, his wife, Michelle. But it was a very exciting time to be here last night, because people were just up on their feet at several points in the speeches, and I think we're going to see more of that tonight too.
Of course, there was a lot of, kudos to President Joe Biden, much as he stepped away, and he spoke last night. What did you pick from there? What were the real key highlights of what he said last night?
I think some of the things that he said that were the key highlights were, I love my country, or I love my job, but I love my country more. And directly after he said that, he said, and there's been this talk that I was angry about the leaders, the Democratic leaders who came and spoke to me and asked me to step aside. And he said, I'm not angry. That's not true. So I think that's important to note. And I think one of the main things, the significant things, too, was said at the end of his speech, when he said something to the effect of, besides I love this country, he said, I've given this country my best. I've made mistakes many times over my career, but I've given this country my best over the past 50 years. And, of course, that got thunderous applause.
And Carol, quickly, the protesters are still out there next to the DNC venue. What are they calling attention to today?
Yeah, and, important to note that we don't really see them around here. The police have cordoned off this area like crazy. I mean, there's like a mile radius around here. Sorry for that. They're gearing up for tonight, so they're testing out the music and the stereo system. But anyway, the protesters were out in force again, not the tens of thousands that organizers said to expect, more like thousands. But there were over 200 groups that were part of a coalition of pro-Palestinian protesters who want the next administration, and they're hoping it's the Harris-Waltz administration, to not arm Israel anymore in the Israel-Hamas war. So they had their placards out and they were protesting in force. And it was, for the most part, peaceful. However, 4 protesters were arrested when there was a breaching of the fence in a not very obvious area, and they were quickly detained. But nothing ever got out of control. There were also people out there who were talking about we must return the reproductive rights of women and LGBTQ rights.
Carol, thanks. VOA's Carol Van Dam reporting live for us from the DNC in Chicago. African Americans are often overlooked as a major contributor to political success. VOA's Anthony Labruto spoke to Chris Towler, a partner and principal investigator for Black Insights, a nonpartisan research and political polling company specializing in African American and African immigrant participation in U.S. elections, for a look into how the demographic may influence this year's elections.
Campaigning for the 2024 United States general election is well underway, with Democrats and Republicans fighting to win the next presidency, Senate, and House of Representative elections. As the Republican nominee, former President Donald Trump and presumptive Democratic nominee, incumbent Vice President Kamala Harris, look to court undecided voters, one major voting bloc often goes overlooked. African Americans and African immigrants, colloquially known to pollsters and analysts as the black vote, have remained a target demographic to both parties.
The parties have been pretty split when it comes to civil rights and when it comes to issues of equality, equity, and diversity, where the Democrats have been far more progressive than Republicans, building on sort of that civil rights legacy of the 1960s, which has led black voters more often than not to wholeheartedly support Democrats, as Republicans have. There's been little detraction from the Democratic Party since then because of the Republican Southern strategy in the 1960s.
Members of the then Democratic majority made passing the Voting Rights Act, which extended the right to vote to black Americans, a priority in the 1960s. 60 years later, that legacy continues to influence African American voting habits.
That generalization comes from a shared experience. And so a lot of research and scholars have written about the way that the legacy of slavery continues to inform black political attitudes. It's really not until the last 50 or 60 years that our political institutions have pushed towards a new vision of democracy in which all people, including black people, are viewed equally and included in the political process. And so it's really because of that legacy that black people in this country tend to behave more similarly than other groups and more homogenous when it comes to their political attitudes and political behavior.
Racial demographic shifts in the United States within the last 30 years have only underscored the importance of African American voting participation. Especially amongst southern states and swing states, final vote counts often change by only a few thousand votes year over year.
You know, typically the black community is said to make up about 13% of the American population. That's voting age adults. However, in certain states, as we know, the black community is more concentrated and has a larger voting power. You could talk about Michigan has been in the American news lately, where black voters make up 10 to 20, sometimes close to 30% of the population. And if they get out and vote at or above that level, say they represent their population proportion in the voting age or in the constituency, they can make a real difference in those elections.
Leading up to the general election in November, Towler and his team of pollsters and data scientists will be the first major group since the 1980s to be conducting panels and polls specifically looking at black voting participation and election attitudes in the United States. Anthony Labruto, VOA News, Washington.
There are many challenges facing the U.S. presidential election by way of online manipulation and the rise of political violence. Kian Vestinson is a senior research analyst for technology and democracy for the human rights group Freedom House. He tells VOA's Philip Alexiou about the many factors that could play out during this year's election.
Here in the United States, disinformation facilitated by generative AI is not a real problem now. We've seen in the campaign cycle so far that generative AI is used by campaigns to post memes or silly little images on their campaign websites that are clearly fake, clearly manipulated. We haven't seen evidence that generative AI has been deployed in the US election context in a way that meaningfully could sway voters, could fool people. But that threat is very much present, and it's really important for campaigns to make sure that they're not generating convincing deep fakes that could be used to paint their opponents. And it's really important for technology companies to protect against the misuse of their tools in an elections context.
So I read something interesting here on the one of the questions you brought up, the United States scoring 3 out of 4, but is there academic freedom and is the educational system free from extensive political indoctrination? We've sort of been hearing about that. That's sort of an underlying factor, it sounds like, in the vulnerability index. Can you touch on that a little bit and where things stand in that regard?
Absolutely. So our index gathers a whole host of data points from Freedom House research. One component of the index is measuring whether people in universities and the education system, both teachers and students, have the ability to carry out their work and their learning free from political interference and intimidation. That indicator that you referenced, I believe, was declined in recent years to reflect the fact that university professors across the country and everyday high school teachers, middle school teachers, elementary school teachers are feeling increasing pressure to say certain things and avoid certain topics that might be ramped up in the culture war. And in some cases, we've seen that government officials have tried to interfere unduly in the teaching of American history and American politics. That's really a problem when it comes to ensuring that people have the tools to participate in the balloting process and making political decisions free from interference in November.
The other would be, I think, electronic voting machines that people also have concerns about.
So we've looked into this, at length, and I'll say that certainly there are concerns that some voting infrastructure is old and outdated, but there are very few signs that that's actually making our infrastructure more vulnerable. Back in 2022, after the midterms, the U.S. intelligence community sat down and they looked at all of the threats that they assessed over the course of the 2022 election process. And they said that there were no attempts by foreign state-backed hackers to try to break into U.S. U.S. election infrastructure, including electronic voting machines. So there are lots of evidence that these electronic voting machines are robust and that people can vote on them freely and safely come November without concern.
That was Kian Vestinson, a senior research analyst for technology and democracy at the human rights group Freedom House, speaking to VOA's Philip Alexiou. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is in the Middle East on Tuesday to further push an agreement presented by Washington for a ceasefire deal in the Israeli-Hamas war. Blinken's visit comes as U.S. President Joe Biden faces mounting pressure over his stance on the conflict amid pro-Palestinian protests and worries about Muslim and Arab American votes in presidential election swing states. However, with the Palestinian Islamist group announcing a resumption of suicide bombing inside Israel after many years and claiming responsibility for a blast in the Tel Aviv on Sunday night, and medics saying Israeli military strikes killed at least 30 Palestinians across the Gaza Monday, there are few signs of conciliation and fears of wider war. Sudan's Sovereign Council says it will allow the use of the Adre border crossing with Chad for 3 months to allow humanitarian agencies to send aid into areas of the Darfur region that are threatened with famine. Tom Perriello, the U.S. Special Envoy for Sudan, spoke about the situation in Sudan.
There was this sense that the world was going to go to sleep on Sudan in August. And I think our collective interest was to make sure the world was jolted wide awake about the scale of the famine and the violence inside Sudan.
Perriello says the negotiations are focusing on the activation of 3 different arteries for humanitarian access: the Daba Road, the Center Access, and Adre. The crippling humanitarian crisis has left half of Sudan's population of 50 million facing food insecurity. Still to come, health officials worldwide are on high alert for the spread of Mpox. We'll be right back.
On the next Straight Talk Africa, U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris will receive the official nomination at the Democratic National Convention taking place this week in Chicago. Early voting in the U.S. starts in September, and the race is close with the Republican nominee, former President Donald Trump.
We're not going back.
Join me, Vincent McCory, for an in-depth analysis of the U.S. presidential election on Straight Talk Africa.
The World Health Organization recommends that babies be exclusively breastfed for the first 6 months of life. Yet it has been reported that many mothers in Africa do not exclusively breastfeed their infants due to changing cultural norms and lactation challenges. On the next edition of Our Voices, we'll explore how breastfeeding can contribute significantly to the child's survival and look at options for new mothers to produce or get access to safe breast milk. Join the conversation each week right here on Our Voices.
In other news, the Malawian government is receiving an insurance payout of $11.2 million for an El Nino-linked drought that led to the southern African nation declaring a state of disaster earlier this year. Malawi had a drought insurance policy through the African Development Bank and the African Risk Capacity Group, an agency of the African Union. Health officials in Pakistan say a case of the Mpox detected in their country last week is not the same strain of the virus spreading across Africa. Officials have determined that the case in Pakistan can be classified as Clade 2B. The outbreak in the Democratic Republic of Congo is associated with Clade 1B. And the United Nations is condemning what it calls an unacceptable level of violence that is becoming commonplace against humanitarian workers. A record 280 workers were killed in 33 countries in 2023. The UN is warning that the Israel-Hamas war in Gaza is potentially fueling even higher numbers of such deaths this year. As parts of Nigeria struggle with food insecurity, many young Nigerians and startups are seeking to revolutionize the agricultural sector through technology. In Kaduna State, a young man has invented a drone that can detect crop diseases. Al-Hassan Bala reports from Abuja.
In their small workspace in Nigeria's northwestern state of Kaduna, 24-year-old Shamsuddin Jibril and his team create drones designed to detect crop diseases and spray insecticides. A 2022 National Agricultural Survey showed that some of the country's farmers lost up to 80% of their crops to pests and diseases. Jibril says his startup company, Vora Robotics, is helping develop more efficient farming practices.
We use local available material to develop it in order to be cost effective. This is our manufactured local drone that we did. Our main focus is the agriculture. We are trying to see how we can bring the solutions to them and also to help them to detect diseases in their farm.
Jibril says that the drone takes photo of crops and sends them to an application he and his team created that analyzes and provides results within minutes.
On that app, it will show you the symptom of that and the treatment that you should do for that farm. And also it will tell you how the chemical you're supposed to use. Maybe, there's different type of chemical, acid pesticide or for the gas or insecticide for the insect.
In 2024 alone, ginger farmers lost over $7 million in crops to disease. Small-scale farmer Lawal Ibrahim Dambusha says the inability to detect crop diseases early put farmers at a major disadvantage.
Ba na'ura ba za mu iya ganewa ba don mafi yawancin manomi abin da ya fi sani daga tana sai gwazarma. To amma akwai sauran wasu abubuwa da suke wa amfani illa suke bin saiwoyin shi da sauransu wanda ba kowane manomi zai iya gane wannan sauran. Amma in aka yi amfani da irin waɗannan na'urorin za su taimake mu 100% kuma harkokin noma za su bunƙasa a Najeriya.
Agricultural experts say the Nigerian government can do more to promote the use of technology in the agriculture sector. One of them, Ezekiel Bulus Doka, says technology like the crop diseases detector can be a game changer in Nigeria's search for food security.
There are so many innovations that would have transformed Nigerian agriculture, but how those in authority, how do they accept it? And how do they push it forward? How do they fight for it to be scale up?
Jibril and his team are hopeful that they will receive support from the government and the private sector to expand their innovation to the entire country. Al-Hassan Bala, VOA News, Abuja, Nigeria.
It's time for a health report, and joining us now is Africa 54 health correspondent Lino Mudu with the latest on Mpox vaccines. Hello, Lino.
Hello, Esther. The resurgence and spread of Mpox has health officials worldwide on high alert. At least 13 countries in Africa have reported cases of the disease. Joining us live from Brazzaville, Congo, is Dr. Matshidiso Moeti, the WHO Regional Director for Africa. Dr. Moeti, thank you so much for joining us today. How concerning is the Mpox outbreak with cases spreading now in Europe? And what are the main challenges in managing it across different regions in Africa?
Yeah. Thank you very much for having me to talk about this very important subject. I think the declaration of Mpox as a public health emergency of international concern by the World Health Organization and also of continental concern by the African Centers for Disease Control of the African Union underscores the seriousness of the outbreak and, more importantly, the risk for international spread both within Africa and beyond Africa. We've now been told that there is a case in Sweden and also a case in Pakistan. So it just underlines then the importance of working together across countries and across continents to make sure that we contain the spread of this virus. If just coming back to Africa, you know, this disease has been endemic in some areas, but we're starting to see in Eastern Africa, particularly around Kivu, spread to new countries, neighboring countries like Burundi, Rwanda, Uganda, and there was one case in Kenya. That underlines the to new countries, even in Africa. And under these circumstances, we may find in very faraway places healthcare workers and healthcare systems that are not expecting Mpox, may be unaware what this is, and therefore enable and allow the spread to go further. We may also find populations that have been exposed before that don't have any level of immunity to this virus and get seriously ill. I think all of this underlines the fact that not only in the region of Africa, where we have the epicenter in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, but globally, we need to be working together to raise awareness, to mobilize the resources, to increase the preparedness of people, health systems, and countries to recognize that Mpox has arrived. The virus is sometimes changing so that it's affecting different population subgroups, so that we work globally together to contain this virus.
And Dr. Moeti, speaking of resources, vaccine availability has been a challenge. A country like Nigeria has been dealing with Mpox for a few years now with no access to vaccine. Who is supposed to be vaccinated at this point, and what is being done to ensure equitable access?
Yes. I mean, clearly the most at risk people, starting, I would say, with the healthcare workers who might get into the first contact with somebody who presents at a clinic or a hospital and they have to nurse them, are really the first, the most important people to vaccinate. So frontline health workers, frontline responders need to be protected so that the health systems then don't collapse under the weight of this virus as it spread. And then secondly, of course, people who are closely in contact with cases within families and household members, intimate partners, should also be vaccinated. There are some people who have health conditions that make their immune system compromised. People living with HIV, for example, particularly those not on treatment, may also be more susceptible to severe illness if they get Mpox. So the issue of access to vaccines is something on which we are working collectively at the international level, WHO, the Africa CDC, other partners. And this really is a case of negotiating with the pharmaceutical companies that are able to produce this vaccine to ensure that they scale up their production and increase the availability of vaccines. Of course, that also means working with funders who would then be able to finance access to vaccines. WHO, because these are new vaccines, is working on issuing a new licensing to have access to the vaccine. So it really, I think, is about working